Every man in the world wants beauty, and every beautiful woman in the world wants money. This is not an insult. This is not a joke. This is the oldest, most unspoken transaction in human history. And once you understand the mechanics behind it, you will never look at attraction, relationships, or your own ambition the same way again. For thousands of years, this exchange has quietly governed courtship, marriage, status, and survival. It shaped kingdoms. It decided who ruled and who served. It built empires and collapsed them. And today, in the world of dating apps, luxury brands, and social media validation, it is still running exactly the same code, just with a modern interface. The rules have not changed, only the packaging has. By the end of this, you will understand why this dynamic exists, why it is not evil or shallow, but deeply biological. Why chasing beauty without building value destroys men from the inside. Why beauty without depth eventually destroys women from the inside too. And most importantly, how to step outside this transaction entirely and build a life where you are never the one begging at the table. Let's start with the uncomfortable biological truth that most people are too polite to say out loud. Human attraction did not evolve in boardrooms or in poetry. It evolved on a savanna. Thousands of generations before money, before civilization, before anyone wrote a single love song. Back then, survival was not guaranteed. A woman who chose the wrong partner didn't just risk heartbreak. She risked starvation, death during childbirth, and the death of her children. A man who chose the wrong partner didn't risk his life the same way, but he risked something else, wasting his limited reproductive resources on offspring that weren't biologically strong or fertile. This created two completely different evolutionary filters. Men evolved to unconsciously scan for signals of youth, health, and fertility, which the brain interprets on a purely animal level as beauty. Clear skin, symmetry, a certain waist-to-hip ratio, energy in the eyes. These aren't arbitrary preferences invented by magazines. They are ancient biological signals that say this person can carry life forward successfully. Women, on the other hand, evolved to scan for a completely different signal, the ability to provide, protect, and secure resources over the long haul, especially during pregnancy and early motherhood, when a woman is at her most physically vulnerable. This is called parental investment theory, first mapped out by evolutionary biologist Robert Trivers in the 1970s. The sex that invests more in raising offspring becomes more selective about who they mate with. Human women invest 9 months of pregnancy, physical risk, and years of early caregiving. That is an enormous biological cost. So evolution wired women to be more selective, and one of the strongest selection filters became resource access, what we now casually call money. This is why, across nearly every culture in recorded history, from ancient Rome to feudal Japan, to Victorian England to modern Wall Street, you see the same pattern repeating. Men pursuing beauty, women on average statistically, not universally, filtering for status and resource capacity. It's not shallow. It's not even a choice most people consciously make. It's software running underneath the operating system of modern dating, dressed up in flowers, candlelight, and Instagram captions. Now, here's where most people stop thinking, right at the biology. But biology is only step one. What happened next is where things get dangerous, because humans didn't stay in the wild. We built civilizations, and civilizations turned this biological instinct into an economic system. Look at the dowry systems of ancient India, the bride price traditions across parts of Africa. The arranged marriages of European nobility designed purely to merge fortunes and territories. Marriage for most of human history was never primarily about love. It was a resource contract disguised as romance. Kings married their daughters to other kingdoms, not out of affection but to secure alliances and gold. Beautiful daughters were quite literally treated as appreciating assets. The more desirable the woman, the higher the price a family could negotiate in the marriage market. Cleopatra understood this better than almost anyone in history. She wasn't, by most historical accounts, conventionally the most beautiful woman of her era, but she mastered the exchange completely. She used charisma, intelligence, and calculated presentation to align herself first with Julius Caesar, then with Mark Antony, securing not romance but political and financial survival for an entire nation. She played the game at the highest level that has ever been recorded, and she played it because she understood something most people still don't. Attraction, when it's not backed by leverage, is a currency that devalues the moment you stop being useful to the person holding the power. This is the first hard truth. Beauty is a currency. Money is a currency. And like any currency, its value is not fixed. It is negotiated constantly. In every interaction, whether people admit it or not. Now let's talk about what happens to the man who doesn't understand this exchange, because this is where the real damage happens. And it's happening to millions of men right now without them even realizing it. A man who has not built resource value, financial stability, purpose, self-respect, discipline, but who desperately wants beauty walks into every interaction from a position of deficit. He is, without knowing it, negotiating from weakness, and weakness in any negotiation gets exploited, not necessarily out of malice, but because that is simply what leverage does. It's the same reason a desperate seller accepts a lowball offer and a desperate buyer overpays. Desperation broadcasts itself, and the market, romantic or financial, always prices it in. This is where the psychological trap closes around him. Robert Cialdini, the psychologist who spent decades studying influence and persuasion, identified a principle called reciprocity. We feel unconsciously obligated to give back to those who give to us. A man who lacks value but wants beauty often tries to compensate through excessive giving. Constant gifts, constant attention, constant emotional labor, constant validation. He believes he is building connection. In reality, he is often triggering a completely different psychological dynamic. One where he becomes valuable only as a resource dispenser, not as a person. Psychologist Stephen Karpman mapped this exact pattern in what's known as the drama triangle. In relationships built on imbalance, people unconsciously fall into three roles: the victim, the persecutor, and the rescuer. A man overgiving to compensate for lack of self-value often plays rescuer, solving problems, funding lifestyles, absorbing emotional weight while quietly resenting that none of it earns him actual respect or reciprocated depth. And the moment he stops rescuing, the relationship built on that dynamic collapses because it was never built on mutual value in the first place. It was built on an unspoken transaction, and the transaction just ended. This is not a story about villains, it's a story about incentive structures. And here's the second hard truth. Most people never say out loud, the same trap exists in reverse, and it is just as destructive. A woman who builds her entire identity, self-worth, and social value around beauty alone is quietly building a business with a shrinking product line. Beauty, biologically, is a depreciating asset. It peaks, plateaus, and declines. This is simple, observable biology, not an opinion. A woman who has spent her 20s leveraging beauty for resources without simultaneously building financial literacy, skills, independence, or emotional depth will eventually hit a devastating moment. The market that once rewarded her heavily begins rewarding her less, and she has no other currency to fall back on. Sociologist Irving Goffman describes social life as a kind of theater, what he called the presentation of self. Every person performs a role depending on their audience, curating what gets shown and what gets hidden. A woman whose entire performance is built around a single asset, beauty, has a fragile stage. One bad decade, one health issue, one shift in cultural beauty standards, and the entire performance she built her security on can lose its box office power. This is why the wisest women throughout history, not the most beautiful, but the wisest, always diversified. Empress Wu Zetian of Tang Dynasty China rose from a low-ranking concubine to become the only female emperor in Chinese history. Not because she was the most beautiful woman in the palace, but because she mastered political strategy, alliances, and administration, skills that don't expire with age. So now we have two mirrored traps. The man who chases beauty without building value burns himself out, compensating for a deficit that giving alone can never fill. The woman who leverages beauty without building depth builds a fortune on a foundation with a countdown clock. Both are chasing an external validation loop instead of building something internal and permanent. And this is the real subject of everything you're about to learn. Not beauty, not money, but the difference between value that is borrowed and value that is owned. Let's go deeper into what value actually means, because most people use the word without ever defining it, and vague definitions are exactly how people stay stuck. Value is not the same as money. Money is simply the most visible, most easily measured expression of value, but it is downstream of something else. Value is your capacity to solve problems, create outcomes, and generate results that other people cannot easily replicate. A man with money but no discipline, no character, and no self-command is still operating from a fragile position, because money without the internal architecture to sustain and grow it evaporates. Studies on lottery winners consistently show that a significant percentage return to their original financial baseline, or worse, within a few years, precisely because the money was never matched by the internal skill set required to hold it. The resource changed, the man didn't. This is the exact same failure point as the man chasing beauty without value. And it reveals the deeper principle underneath everything we've discussed. External rewards without internal architecture always regress to the mean. You can win the lottery of beauty, money, or status temporarily, but if you have not built the internal discipline to sustain what you've won, it slips through your hands exactly like sand through open fingers. This is why the ancient Stoics, 2,000 years before modern psychology existed, arrived at a strikingly similar conclusion through pure philosophical reasoning. Marcus Aurelius, arguably the most powerful man alive during his reign as Roman emperor, wrote privately in his journal, never intended for publication, about the danger of tying his sense of worth to anything external. status, wealth, admiration, even the opinions of the Senate that surrounded him daily. He called these things indifference, not because they don't matter at all, but because they are not fully within your control, and building your identity on things outside your control guarantees suffering the moment those things shift. Epictetus, a former slave who became one of history's most influential Stoic philosophers, put it even more directly. Some things are within our power and some things are not. Beauty fades, markets crash, attraction shifts, attention moves to someone newer. But discipline, character, skill, and self-command, these compound. They are the only currencies in existence that do not depreciate with time. If anything, they appreciate the longer you hold them. This brings us to the actual solution. Not a trick, not a manipulation tactic, but a complete reframe of the entire exchange we started with. The goal is not to win the beauty for money transaction. The goal is to become the kind of person who no longer needs to participate in it from a position of scarcity. This is the real meaning of self-mastery, and it operates on 4 compounding layers. The first layer is financial architecture, not just earning money, but building systems that generate it independent of your direct time and effort, skills that are rare and valuable, income streams that don't require your constant presence, and habits of saving and investing that turn short-term earnings into long-term freedom. A man with financial architecture isn't performing wealth for an audience. He's quietly building a structure that will outlast any single relationship, job, or opportunity. The second layer is physical command, not vanity, but discipline over your own body. Sleep, nutrition, movement, posture, presence. This is not about chasing beauty standards to compete in the same shallow game we just deconstructed. It's about the simple fact that a body under your command signals without a single word that your mind is also under your command. Psychologists call this embodied cognition, the idea that physical state directly shapes psychological state, and vice versa. Discipline in the body becomes evidence both to yourself and to others of discipline in the mind. The third layer is emotional command, the ability to stay regulated under pressure, to communicate directly instead of manipulating indirectly, and to hold boundaries without needing to explain or justify them excessively. Daniel Goleman's research on emotional intelligence found that self-regulation and social awareness were often stronger predictors of long-term success and relationship stability than raw intelligence or charisma alone. A man who reacts to every emotional trigger is easy to read, easy to predict, and easy to manipulate. A man who stays composed under pressure becomes genuinely difficult to control, not through aggression but through sheer internal stability. The fourth layer is purpose architecture, having a mission larger than the pursuit of approval, whether that approval comes from a romantic partner, social media, or society at large. Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist who survived Nazi concentration camps, observed that the people most likely to survive unimaginable suffering weren't the physically strongest. They were the ones who had a clear sense of purpose pulling them forward. A man anchored to purpose stops needing beauty, money, or status to validate his existence because his sense of meaning is generated from within, not borrowed from outside. When these 4 layers compound together, financial architecture, physical command, emotional command, and purpose, something interesting happens, and it's almost paradoxical. The man who no longer needs beauty as validation becomes, ironically, far more attractive to the exact kind of high-value partner he was previously chasing from a position of desperation. This isn't manipulation. It's simple market psychology. Scarcity increases perceived value, and a man who is not scarce with his attention, not desperate for approval, and not performing for validation becomes genuinely scarce in a crowded market of men who are doing the opposite. The same reversal applies to the other side of this exchange. A woman who builds financial literacy, skill, purpose, and emotional depth alongside her physical presence is no longer trading a single depreciating asset. She's operating from a diversified position, and diversified positions in any market are simply more resilient. She is no longer vulnerable to the exact moment beauty alone would have failed her because she built other currencies that never stop appreciating. This is the actual endgame that almost nobody talks about directly. The healthiest, most stable, longest-lasting relationships are not built on the original transaction of beauty for money at all. They are built when both people have already exited the scarcity game individually, when neither person needs the other to complete them financially, emotionally, or socially, and what remains once the need is removed is actual choice, not desperation, not leverage, not a transaction, a choice made freely by 2 people who no longer require anything from each other to feel whole. That is the difference between a relationship built on need and a relationship built on want, and it is the single most important distinction in this entire subject. Need creates leverage, leverage creates imbalance, and imbalance eventually creates resentment on one side and control on the other. Want, built from 2 complete people, creates partnership, the only version of this exchange that survives the test of time, health, market shifts, and age. Now let's expose something darker, because understanding this exchange also means understanding how it gets deliberately weaponized by people who know exactly what they're doing. There's a specific category of person, not most people, but a real and recognizable minority, who studies this transaction not to escape it, but to exploit it with precision. In psychology, this pattern often overlaps with what's called the dark triad: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. People high in these traits are frequently skilled at reading exactly what another person values: beauty validation, financial security, and manufacturing just enough of it to keep the other person hooked without ever delivering the full, stable version of it. This is where love bombing comes from: an intense, overwhelming early flood of attention, gifts, and affection designed to accelerate attachment before the other person can properly evaluate character. It works because of a cognitive bias called the halo effect, documented by psychologist Edward Thorndike. Once we perceive one strongly positive trait in someone, we unconsciously assume other unrelated traits are positive too. A man who gifts early gets coded as trustworthy, though generosity and trustworthiness aren't correlated. A stunning woman gets coded as kind or honest, though beauty has no bearing on either. Exploiters know this. They lead with the trait that triggers the halo, then use the borrowed trust to extract what they actually want. The counter to this isn't cynicism. Treating everyone as a threat destroys your ability to build real connection just as effectively as naivety does. The counter is simple and practical. Slow down the timeline. Genuine character reveals itself under boredom, stress, and time, not under the artificial intensity of a first month. Anyone can perform generosity or beauty for 30 days. Almost nobody can fake consistency, patience, and emotional regulation for a full year. This single habit, extending your evaluation window, quietly filters out almost every manipulator, because manipulation is expensive to sustain and nearly always collapses under long enough observation. There's a second exploitation pattern worth naming, because it explains why people stay in relationships they already know are unbalanced: sunk cost thinking. Nobel-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman, alongside Amos Tversky, showed that humans feel the pain of a loss roughly twice as intensely as the pleasure of an equivalent gain: loss aversion. Applied here, the longer someone has invested money, time, or energy into this transaction, the harder it becomes to walk away even once it's clearly failing. Walking away doesn't feel like avoiding a future loss. It feels like admitting the past investment is already gone. That admission is so painful that people keep pouring resources into a failing dynamic just to avoid confronting the sunk cost, deepening the loss further. Casino operators understand this principle better than almost anyone alive, and they design entire environments around it. Now overlay all of this onto the modern digital environment, because the transaction we've been discussing has not slowed down in the internet age, it has been industrialized. Every major social platform is engineered around a principle B.F. Skinner discovered in the 1950s through experiments on pigeons: variable ratio reinforcement. Skinner found that rewards delivered unpredictably, not on a fixed schedule, but randomly, produced the most compulsive, hardest to extinguish behavior of any reward pattern tested. This is exactly how the like button, the match notification, and the tip alert work. You don't know when the next hit of validation is coming, so you keep checking, keep posting, keep performing. This has taken the ancient beauty for resources exchange and turned it into a 24-hour automated marketplace. Platforms built around paid subscriptions and gifting have made the transaction so literal that money now moves directly, in real time, from attention-starved men to image-curated women, with an algorithm sitting in the middle optimizing for maximum engagement on both sides, not maximum well-being for either. Dating apps distort the same exchange in a different direction. Data pulled from major dating platforms over the past decade consistently shows a heavily skewed distribution. A small percentage of male profiles receive the overwhelming majority of engagement, while the remaining majority compete for what's left. This isn't because most men are unattractive. It's because the interface strips away everything except the visual filter, collapsing weeks of real-world value assessment into a half-second swipe. The environment has made the beauty side of the transaction faster and more visible than ever, while making the value side of the transaction, character, stability, ambition, almost invisible until several messages in, if it's ever seen at all. Understanding this isn't a reason to despair over modern dating. It's a reason to stop competing on the platform's terms entirely and to build the kind of undeniable, hard-to-fake value that surfaces naturally in real environments through work, community, and shared pursuits, where the full transaction can actually be evaluated instead of guessed at from a photograph. There's one more historical mirror worth placing here, because it shows that the smartest operators in this exchange throughout history were never the most beautiful. They were the most strategically diversified. The courtesans of Renaissance Venice, women like Veronica Franco, operated in a society that offered almost no formal path to female education, property ownership, or political voice. Yet Franco became a published poet, a trusted advisor to some of the most powerful men in Venice, and wealthy enough to fund a shelter for other women in vulnerable positions. She didn't outcompete other women on beauty alone. The city was full of beautiful women. She outlasted them by pairing appearance with wit, literacy, and political intelligence at a time when almost no woman was permitted to develop any of those things. 400 years later, the lesson hasn't changed at all. It's simply been repackaged into a modern vocabulary of personal brand and diversified income. Let's make this concrete. Because philosophy without mechanism is just entertainment, and this channel isn't built to entertain you for 20 minutes and leave you exactly where you started. Financial architecture is built the same way a body is built, through small, boring, repeated inputs that compound far beyond what they appear to be worth in the moment. James Clear's research into habit formation, popularized in his work on atomic habits, makes a point that applies perfectly here. Outcomes are lagging indicators of your systems, not your intentions. A man who reads useful material for 30 minutes a day, invests a fixed percentage of every payment he receives before he spends anything else, and builds one monetizable skill deliberately for a full year will, almost without exception, be operating from a fundamentally different resource position than a man with better intentions but no system. The gap between these two men will look invisible after week 1, noticeable after month 6, and completely unbridgeable after 5 years. Not because one man was smarter, but because compounding is patient, and it rewards consistency far more than it rewards intensity. The specific skill matters less than most people assume. What matters is choosing something with genuine scarcity value, a capability that solves a real problem for people who are willing to pay for the solution, and going deep enough that you become difficult to replace. Cal Newport, in his research on career capital, found that people who chase passion first and skill second consistently end up less satisfied and less secure than people who build rare, valuable skill first and let genuine passion and autonomy follow as a natural byproduct of being good enough at something that the world starts negotiating on your terms instead of the other way around. This single reversal, skill before passion, value before validation, quietly undoes almost everything this entire subject has been describing. Physical command follows the same compounding logic. You don't need extremity here, you need consistency. 7 hours of sleep, most nights, rebuilds the cognitive and hormonal foundation that almost every other layer depends on. Sleep researcher Matthew Walker's work has shown that even moderate chronic sleep restriction measurably degrades decision-making, emotional regulation, and testosterone production, all of which quietly undermine every other layer we've discussed. Add regular resistance training, a diet that isn't actively working against you, and consistent daylight exposure, and you've built physical command without needing to obsess over it. This isn't about becoming a different person, it's about removing the small chronic weaknesses that make every other layer harder to sustain. Emotional command is trained the same way a muscle is trained, under controlled resistance, repeated over time. Every time you feel the urge to react instantly to a provocation, a rejection, or a slight, and you instead pause before responding, you are literally strengthening the neural pathway responsible for self-regulation. Neuroscientists and psychiatrists, researchers studying the prefrontal cortex have shown that this region, responsible for impulse control and long-term planning, physically strengthens with deliberate practice, much like a muscle under repeated load, and weakens with disuse, exactly like a muscle that stops being trained. Every uncomfortable conversation you have directly instead of avoiding, every boundary you hold without over-explaining it, every moment you choose composure over a reactive outburst is a single rep in a gym that has no mirrors and no witnesses, but produces results that eventually become impossible to hide. And purpose architecture. The final layer is built simply by choosing a mission that would still matter to you even if no one ever saw it, applauded it, or rewarded it. If the only reason you're pursuing something is the audience watching you pursue it, the moment the audience disappears, so does your motivation. But if the mission is genuinely yours, something you would still choose on a random Tuesday with nobody watching, it becomes a source of stability that no beauty standard, market shift, or social algorithm can ever touch, because it was never dependent on external approval to begin with. So here's the final reframe, and it's the one thing I want you to actually carry out of this video and into your life starting today. Stop asking how to win the beauty for money game. Start asking a completely different question. What internal architecture am I building that no market crash, no aging process, and no shift in circumstance can take away from me? Because that, not beauty, not money, not attraction, not approval, is the only form of value that was ever actually yours to keep. Build the version of yourself that doesn't need to chase anything, because everything worth having is drawn towards stability, discipline, and quiet, self-generated power. That is not a theory, that is the oldest law in human history, hiding in plain sight underneath every transaction we just spent this entire video unpacking. If this gave you a new way to see attraction, value, and self-mastery, make sure you subscribe to Apex Motivation so you don't miss what's coming next. Hit like if this shifted something in how you think, and share it with someone who needs to hear it before they burn themselves out chasing the wrong currency. This channel exists to build men and women who no longer negotiate from weakness. Stay close because we're just getting started.